Page 46, blank. Page 47, Section 1, Issues and Perspectives. Page 48, blank. Page 49, The Position of Women in Hindu Civilization, Retrospect and Prospect. A. S. Altekar, Altekar. Para. Women once enjoyed considerable freedom and privileges in the spheres of family, religion, and public life. But as centuries rolled on, the situation went on changing adversely. On the other hand, the proprietary rights went on gradually expanding in spite of the growing tendency to regard women as unfit for independence. Para. It will be convenient to divide the period we have to survey into 4 divisions. 1. The age of the Rig Veda from circa 2500 to circa 1500 BC. 2. The age of the later Samhitas, Brahmanas and Upanishads from circa 1500 BC to circa 500 BC. 3. The age of the Sutras, epics, and early Smritis from circa 500 BC to circa AD 500. 4. The age of later Smritis, commentators and digest writers from circa AD 500 to circa AD 1800. Para. The periods of the last 2 epochs are chronologically definite. Those of the first 2 are, however, rather vague, and there is as yet no unanimity about their precise duration. The limits suggested for them above are, however, the most probable ones and are usually accepted by the majority of scholars. Para. For the purposes of the proposed survey, period by period, it is unfortunately not possible to divide the history into smaller and more numerous periods. The data at our disposal are too scanty for the purpose. The difficulty is further increased by our inability to know the precise dates of many of our authorities. Some of the works are further composite ones. There can be, for instance, no doubt that the present Mahabharata and Manusmriti contain ideas popular in epochs which were separated from each other by more than half a millennium. The period-wise survey is therefore beset with considerable difficulties, but has to be nevertheless attempted for the general reader in the interest of clarity. Page 50. The Rigvedic age circa 2500 BC to 1500 BC. Para. The position of women in the Vedic age was far from being analogous to what it usually is in early uncivilized societies. In communities that have not yet emerged from barbarism, there hardly exist any checks on the tyranny of man over woman. Ill usage, underfeeding, and overworking are pushed to the greatest limit, compatible with the preservation of the race. Women are divorced, abandoned, sold, or killed at the mere whim of men. They have to carry about children and also serve as beasts of burden when the tribe moves from one place to another. The treatment thus meted out to them need not cause any surprise. In primitive life, the muscle was an indispensable element in success, and the man was stronger in it than the woman. He fought with the animals and enemies to protect women and children. He chased the big game to feed the family. Physical prowess, bodily vigor, and muscular strength thus naturally established man's permanent superiority over woman, who, besides lacking these qualities, was periodically in a most helpless condition. a few weeks before and after her frequent confinements. Man had not yet developed sufficient culture and sensibility to make him feel and realize that women undergo these trials and tribulations for the sake of the race and therefore deserve to be treated with utmost sympathy and consideration. It was taken for granted everywhere that women as such can have no rights and privileges. They were inherently inferior to men and therefore must be always subordinate to them. The archaic Roman law granted to the husband the power over the life and the limits of the wife, and for many centuries matrons with several children continued to be under the tutelage of their male relations. In ancient Palestine, the woman was a piece of property to be bought and sold. Para. The position which women occupied in Hindu society at the dawn of civilization during the Vedic age is much better than what we ordinarily expect it to have been. There are no doubt a few indications to show that brides were sometimes sold in marriage or even carried away by force, but the better conscience of society had already begun to assert itself and condemn these practices as unholy and unworthy. The ideal marriage of the Vedic period was a religious sacrament which made the couple joint owners of the household. The old tradition that the wife was the property of the husband had not yet completely died down. The famous hymn about gambling in the Rig Veda Roman 10.34 shows that sometimes confirmed gamblers would stake away their wives to their opponents. Page 51. The advice given to the gambler in this hymn, however, shows that social conscience had already begun to disapprove this practice. Para. On the whole, the position of women was fairly satisfactory in the Vedic age. Ordinarily, girls were no doubt less welcome than boys, but we must add that these were also some parents in society who would perform special religious rituals for the good luck of getting learned and capable daughters. Girls were educated like boys and had to pass through a period of brahmacharya. Many of them used to become distinguished poetesses, and the poems of some of them have been honored by their inclusion in the canonical literature. The marriages of girls used to take place at a fairly advanced age, the normal time being the age of 16 or 17. Educated brides of this age had naturally an effective voice in the selection of their partners in life. Very often there were love marriages which were later blessed by parents. There was no seclusion of women. They used to move freely in society, often even in the company of their lovers. In social and religious gatherings, they occupied a prominent position. Women had an absolute equality with men in the eye of religion. They could perform sacrifices independently and were not regarded as an impediment in religious pursuits. Marriage, in fact, was a religious necessity to both the man and the woman. Neither could reach heaven without being accompanied by his duly married consort. The position of the wife was an honored one in the family. In theory, she was the joint owner of the household with her husband, though in actual practice she was the subordinate partner. In rich and royal families, polygamy prevailed to some extent, but ordinarily monogamy was the rule. If a wife had the misfortune to be widowed, she had not to ascend her husband's funeral pyre. The sati custom was not in vogue at all. The widow could, if she liked, contract another marriage, either regularly or under the custom of niyoga. The main disabilities from which women suffered in this age, as well as in the next one, were proprietary ones. They could hold or inherit no property. Para. Landed property could be owned only by one who had the power to defend it against actual or potential rivals and enemies. Women were obviously unable to do this and so could hold no property. The transition from the communal to the family ownership of land was just taking place. The conception of the rights of the different members of the family, even when males, was yet to crystallize. Naturally, therefore, women, like many other male members, page 52, of the family, were incapable of owning property. The patriarch was its sole owner and guardian. Para. We also do not come across any queens reigning independently or as regents. Considering the general position of women as delineated above, these disabilities come as a great surprise to us, but a little reflection will show that they were natural and inevitable. The Aryans were gradually establishing their rule in a foreign country, surrounded on all sides by an indigenous, hostile population that considerably outnumbered them. Under such circumstances, queens ruling in their own rights or as regents were naturally unknown. Para. The position of women on the whole was fairly satisfactory. In the Vedic literature, there are no doubt a few observations like, quote, women have a fickle mind, unquote, comma, quote, women can be easily won over by one who is handsome and can sing and dance well, unquote, stop. They, however, reflect the light-hearted cynicism of some poets and do not embody the considered views of the leaders of society. The community as a whole was showing proper concern and respect for women, allowing them considerable freedom in the different activities of the social and political life. Text continued in next file. Page 52. The position of women continued. The age of the later Samhitas, Brahmanas and Upanishads, circa 1500 BC to circa 500 BC. Para. The changes which took place during this period in the position of women were gradual. Their proprietary rights continued to be unrecognized, the only exception being in favor of marriage gifts of movable property. In the higher sections of society, the sacred initiation, upanayana, of girls was common, and they subsequently used to go through a course of education. Some of them used to attain distinction in the realm of theology and philosophy, and a considerable number of women used to follow the teaching career. There was, however, a gradual decline in female education as the period advanced. The system of sending out girls to famous teachers or centers of education came to be discouraged. It was laid down that the only near relations like father, the brother, or the uncle should teach them at home. Naturally, therefore, religious and secular training became possible only in the case of the girls of rich and cultured families. As a consequence, there arose a tendency to curtail the religious rights and privileges of the average woman. Many functions in the sacrifice, which formerly could be performed, page 53, by the wife alone, now came to be assigned to male substitutes. Some sacrifices like Rudra Yaga and Sita Yaga continued to be performed by women alone, and when the husband was out, the service of the sacrificial fire continued to be entrusted to the wife. In cultured families, women used to recite their Vedic prayers every morning and evening and perform sacrifices on their husband's behalf when they were otherwise preoccupied. Para. The marriage age of the bride continued to be about 16. In practice, if not in theory, brides had some voice in the selection of their partners in life, and Swayamvara was fairly common in Kshatriya circles. The marriage ideals and the mutual relations and rights of the parties continued to be more or less the same as they were in the earlier age. Divorce was permitted to the wife, though the permission was not extensively availed of. The sati custom was altogether unknown, and the widow had the option of remarriage either with her brother-in-law or with an outsider. Naturally, there was no tonsure of widows. Parda was altogether unknown, but women had ceased to attend public meetings. Para. Before we proceed to delineate the picture of the condition of women in the next periods, let us pause a while to consider the causes of this phenomenon of a relatively better condition and status of women in these early centuries, as compared to what it became in subsequent epochs. There took place a continuous and gradual deterioration in the position of women as a whole during the next 2000 years, circa 500 BC to AD 1500. How are we to explain this phenomenon? Usually we find that the condition of women improves as society advances to modern times. How is it that there is an exception in the case of the position of women in Hindu civilization? Para. The relatively more satisfactory position of women in the two epochs we have just surveyed was due partly to political and partly to religious causes. As a rule, in a community which is civilized and is moving in search of pastures, fresh and new, women occupy an honorable position. Men are mostly engrossed in military or semi-military activities, and they have to rely to a very great degree on the help and cooperation of women in the normal spheres and activities of family life. Under such circumstances, women can clearly and convincingly demonstrate to men that they are not parasites, but very useful members of society whose cooperation is very valuable in securing prosperity in peace and victory in war. It is well known how the First World War worked as a miracle in winning over, page 54, the most deadly opponents of women's franchise. The valuable part which women had played in the prosecution of the First World War had disarmed all opposition. Para. It would appear that the general freedom and better status which women enjoyed in the Vedic age were largely due to men being engrossed in the work of conquest and consolidation. Women used to take an active part in agriculture and the manufacture of cloth, bows, arrows, and other war material. They were thus useful members of society and could not be therefore treated with an air of patronage or contempt. The cheap or forced labor of the enslaved population was not yet available to the Aryans for the tasks aforesaid. Para. The exigencies of the political situation in the Vedic period were responsible for the abolition of the prehistoric sati custom and the sanctioning of niyoga and remarriage. Like Hitler and Mussolini, Vedic chiefs were anxious for heroes, more heroes, and still more heroes. The gospel they preached to the householder was not of 8 sons of the later days, but of 10. The non-Aryans were probably outnumbering the Aryans, and they were anxious to have as strong and numerous an army as possible. Under these circumstances, it would have been a suicidal policy to encourage the revival of the obsolete custom of sati or to prohibit widow remarriages. Society came to the definite conclusion that its vital interests demanded that the custom of sati should be interdicted and that widows should be allowed and encouraged to marry and multiply the stock. Para. Another factor responsible for the relatively satisfactory position of women was the influence of religion. Asceticism was at a discount in the Vedic age. Maidens and bachelors had no admission to heaven. Gods accepted no oblations offered by the unmarried. It was essential to offer the ordained sacrifices to gods for procuring happiness and prosperity, both here and hereafter, and they could be properly performed by the husband and the wife officiating together. Wife was not an impediment but an absolute necessity in the religious service. The circumstance naturally helped to raise her status. To enable her to discharge her religious duties properly, it was necessary to ordain that her upanayana should be duly performed. This ensured a proper training and education to girls. It required at least half a dozen years to complete the educational course. That naturally rendered early marriages impracticable. When girls were properly educated and married at the mature age of 16 or 17, a considerable regard had naturally to be shown to their own likes and dislikes at the time of marriage. Page 55. Love marriages were also inevitable when girls remained unmarried to that advanced age and were moving freely in society. Para. It will be thus seen from the above discussion how, down to about 500 BC, the custom of sati and child marriage did not cease to embitter the lot of the woman, how she was properly educated and given the same religious privileges as man, how she could have a voice in the settlement of a marriage and occupy an honored position in the household, how she could move freely in family and society and take an intelligent part in public affairs, and how it was possible for her to take to a career if urged by an inclination or a necessity. Text continued in next file. Page 55. The age of the sutras, epics, and early smritis, circa 500 BC to circa AD 500. The position of women deteriorated considerably in this period, and its causes may be conveniently discussed here. Some centuries before the beginning of this period, the Aryan rule had become well established over the greater part of India. The Aryan conquest of the indigenous population and its loose incorporation in the social structure of the victors as members of the fourth Shudra class had given rise to a huge population of a semi-servile status. Women, however, did not suffer merely because they ceased to be productive members of society. A greater calamity awaited them from the presence of Shudra women. In the earliest period of their expansion, the Aryans followed the traditions of ruthless warfare. Indra, we are told, trampled upon the Dasyus in their cave retreats. When, however, the Aryans reached the upper Gangetic plain, they found that the indigenous civilization there was too deep-rooted to be completely wiped out by them. They had to remain content merely with imposing their sovereignty very often merely a nominal one, over the original inhabitants, variously described as dasas, shudras, or nagas. When the two races proceeded to live together peacefully, intermarriages became inevitable. In the age of the Rig Veda, we do not come across any cases of Arya Shudra marriage. The Brahmanas and the epics, however, supply ample evidence to show that the Aryan chiefs were freely marrying non-Aryan princesses in the later period. Arjuna married Udupi, a Naga princess regent. Bhima married Hirimba, a sister of Rakshasa chief. The sage Kavasa, who played an important part in the Aitareya Brahmana, was the son of a slave girl. Page 56. These are only typical and would show that in the concluding half of the later Samhita period, circa 1000 BC to circa 500 BC, the marriages of Aryan men with non-Aryan women were becoming common. It is important to note that the early Dharma Shastra writers have no objections to an Aryan marrying a Shudra woman, provided he had another Aryan wife. It is only the later writers who proceed to interdict such a procedure with a great vehemence. Footnote 1. Para. The introduction of the non-Aryan wife into the Aryan household is the key to the general deterioration of the position of women that gradually and imperceptibly started at about 1000 BC and became quite marked in about 500 years. The non-Aryan wife, with her ignorance of Sanskrit language and Hindu religion, could obviously not enjoy the same religious privileges as the Aryan consort. Association with her must have tended to affect the purity of speech of the Aryan co-wife as well. Very often the non-Aryan wife may have been the favorite one of her husband, who may have often attempted to associate her with his religious sacrifices in preference to her better educated but less loved Aryan co-wife. This must have naturally led to grave mistakes and anomalies in the performance of the ritual, which must have shocked Orthodox priests. The first remedy they must have thought of was to declare the non-Aryan wife to be unfit for association with her husband in religious rituals. Quote, the black non-Aryan wife may be her husband's associate in pleasure, but not in religious ritual, unquote, say several authorities. Footnote 2. But a mighty king, mad with love for his non-Aryan beloved, was not to be dictated to by a priesthood dependent upon him for his subsistence. He would insist upon having his own favorite wife by his side at the time of his sacrifices, no matter what her race or caste. Para. How then was the situation to be retrieved? Eventually it was felt that the object could be gained by declaring the whole class of women to be ineligible for Vedic studies and religious duties. There would then be no question of rejecting admission to a non-Aryan wife and granting it to an Aryan one. All would be ineligible and none need be offended. It is Aiti Sayana who is seen advocating this view by about 200 BC. It is, however, almost certain that he is merely a typical representative of a powerful school reaching back to a fairly great antiquity. It is not impossible that his school may be as old as 500 BC, if not even earlier. Para. The growing complexity of the Vedic sacrifices was another factor that tended to make the wives' association in religious rituals a more and more formal affair in course of time. Page 57. In the Vedic age, a young maiden would take a soma stalk and proceed straight to offer it to Indra in a sacrifice performed by her all alone. In course of time, the sacrifice became a very complex affair, and the slightest mistake in its performance or in the recitation of its hymns and formulae was regarded as fraught with very grave consequences. It required a long training to get the necessary capacity to follow intelligently the minute details of the complicated sacrifice, and the average woman had not so much time to devote for the purpose. In the Vedic age, she was married at about the age of 16 or 17. She could thus devote 6 or 7 years to her Vedic studies before her marriage. During this period, a girl could equip herself fairly well for her post-marriage participation in sacrifices, as the Vedic literature was then not extensive and could be studied as popular religious poetry. The sacrificial ritual was also simple. Towards the end of the period of the later Samhitas and Brahmanas, a maiden could hardly hope to gain a full and adequate knowledge necessary for the purpose, unless she remained unmarried till about the age of 22 or 24. Page 57. Position of women continued. This was an impracticable proposition for the average girl. There were new forces in society which were clamoring for early marriages. The Aryans had settled down in a rich and prosperous country, and their political supremacy had become unquestioned. Naturally, they took to an easy and luxurious life, and the marriageable age of boys and girls began to be lowered. In the Rigvedic age, the father was anxious to have strong and numerous sons, more for secular than for religious purposes. In the days of the later Samhitas, the son became a religious rather than a secular necessity. A man comes to this world, it was pointed out, saddled with a threefold debt, DEBT. The most important one of these was the debt to the mens, MNAS, which could be liquidated only by the birth of a son. Why then not marry a girl as soon as she attains maturity and is in a position to present a son to her husband? Why wait for 3 or 4 years unnecessarily? It may be noted that when Kanna, Kanva, learns that his daughter had contracted a love marriage with Dushyanta, a passage later interpolated in the Mahabharata represents him as blaming himself rather than his daughter. He practically admits that it was his mistake not to have married his daughter earlier. So many months had passed away uselessly since the time she could have got a son. Footnote 3, para. Owing to the different causes narrated above, at the beginning of this period, circa 500 BC, there arose a tendency to lower the, page 58, marriageable age of girls, and as a consequence, to discourage their upanayana and education. Down to about the beginning of the Christian era, in cases of difficulty, parents were permitted to keep their daughters unmarried to the age of 16 or 17, but it was emphasized that it would be advisable to get them married soon after the attainment of puberty. The view that women should not be at all allowed to participate in sacrifices was no doubt not accepted by society, but its vigorous advocacy by one school, along with the general lowering of the marriage age, tended to a growing and inevitable neglect of the Vedic education of girls. During the first half of this period, a few maidens continued to specialize in Vedic studies and rituals, but the majority of girls used to go merely through the formality of Upanayana just before the celebration of their marriage. It is doubtful whether they were in a position to recite their morning and evening prayers. At about AD 200, it was felt that this meaningless formality should be discontinued. It was declared that marriage was the substitute for Upanayana in the case of girls. They need not have any separate sacred initiation. Para. Upanayana was usually performed at about the age of 9 or 10, and the same age now came to be regarded as the ideal time of marriage for girls. Towards the end of this period, circa AD 500, parents could not usually keep their daughters unmarried after the age of 12. Para. The discontinuance of Upanayana, the neglect of education, and the lowering of the marriage age produced disastrous consequences upon the position and status of women. Early marriage put an effective impediment in the higher education of girls. Brides, being too young and inexperienced, ceased to have any effective voice in the settlement of their marriages. Swayamvara continued to be in vogue in Kshatriya circles, but it came to be condemned by Brahminical writers. Love marriages became a thing of the past. Child wives with no education worth the name became the order of the day, and they could not naturally command respect from their husbands. Not infrequently, parents had to marry their daughters in a hurry, lest the girl should attain puberty before their marriage. The matches arranged under such circumstances were often ill-suited, and women were thus often compelled to spend their lives with unsuitable or unworthy partners. It is painful to find that Smriti writers should have come forward to preach the gospel that a wife should always revere her husband as God, even if he were a moral wreck. Para. During the first half of this period, widow remarriages and niyoga continued to be permitted, page 59, but the volume of public opinion against these customs was increasing, and they came to be eventually interdicted at about AD 500. Marriage was regarded as a religious sacrament in the Vedic period also, and yet society was permitting divorce and remarriage in exceptional cases. During the period under review, marriage became an irrevocable union. Irrevocable, however, only so far as the wife was concerned. The husband could discard his wife for the grave offense of not being sufficiently submissive. The wife, however, could not take a similar step and marry a second time, even if her husband had taken to vicious ways and completely abandoned her. This differential treatment was due to the simple fact that women were no longer able to effectively oppose these absurd theories and claims, most of them being uneducated and quite ignorant of their former status and privileges. Para. The age of city or small states had gone, and the Hindu kingdoms in this period became fairly extensive. The splendor of royal courts naturally increased, and kings began to keep a much bigger harem than what was ever dreamt of in previous epochs. Their example was imitated by their numerous feudatories and rich subjects. This produced a very unfavorable consequence upon the condition and status of the vast majority of women of the upper classes, and it had its natural repercussions on the status of wives in ordinary families. The dictum, quote, "The wife ought to revere her husband as a god, even if he were vicious and void of any merit," unquote, was probably written with a particular reference to the unfortunate denizens of the harems in rich families. Subsequently, the advice came to be extended to the whole sex. One can hardly excuse Smriti writers for having enunciated this absurd and inequitable doctrine, though one can understand that their motive may have been partly to discourage a hasty tendency to sever the marital tie. They have, however, never dreamt of preaching a similar gospel to the husband. They permit him to discard his first wife on the most flimsy grounds. The growing harems of the mighty kings naturally made them jealous, and some of them sought to keep their wives in seclusion. The parda system, however, was yet confined only to a very small section of the royal families. Majority of kings did not care to adopt it. The period of 500 years between 200 BC and AD 300 was a very dark and dismal one for northern India. The fertile plains of the Punjab and the Gangetic Valley were subjected during this period, page 60, to one of foreign invasion after another. First came the Greeks, who under Demetrius and Menander, circa 190 to 150 BC, were able to penetrate right up to Patna in Bihar. Then came the Scythians and the Parthians, circa 100 BC to AD 50, whose frightful wars of conquest reduced Hindu population by one half, 25% being killed and 25% being enslaved and carried away. Footnote 4. These barbarians were followed by the Kushanas, who succeeded in overrunning practically the whole of northern India by the middle of the 2nd century AD. Political reverses, war atrocities, and the decline of population and prosperity naturally produced a wave of despondency in society. It facilitated the spread of the ideal of renunciation, samnyasa, which, though held before society by Upanishadic, Buddhist, and Jain teachers, was meeting with stubborn opposition in Hindu community. Thus, Kautilya prescribes a punishment for a person who would renounce the world before his old age and without providing for his dependents. Footnote 5. Early Dharmashastra writers regard renunciation as a positively anti-Vedic custom. Footnote 6. The despondency prevailing in society at about the beginning of the Christian era began to wear down the opposition to the sannyasa ideal. There is no doubt a good deal of truth in the observation of Bhima at one place in the Mahabharata that renunciation appeals only to those who are unsuccessful in life. Footnote 7. Just as the renunciation philosophy of the Bhakti school appealed to Hindu society in medieval times owing to the political setback which it had received at the time on account of the rise of Islam, so also the ascetic ideal of Upanishads, Jainism and Buddhism began to get a real hold over the social mind only at about the beginning of the Christian era, owing to the prevailing wave of political and economic despondency. Page 60. The position of women in Hindu civilization. Continued. The new development affected the position of the widow adversely in various ways. It strengthened the hands of those who were opposed to niyoga and widow remarriage. Both customs, therefore, fell gradually into disrepute. Niyoga, no doubt, deserved to be stamped out, but not so widow remarriage. It, however, could not escape a similar fate. It began to be argued that the world was a mirage and its pleasures were mere snares. Fate was undoubtedly cruel to the widow in carrying away her husband. It had, however, given her a new opportunity to secure spiritual salvation. It is true that the Vedas have declared that a son was necessary for securing heaven. The childless widow, however, should not think of remarriage in order to get heaven through a son. She ought to aim at the higher ideal of salvation, page 61, bracket, mukti, bracket closes, and not at the lower ones of heaven, bracket, svarga, bracket closes, stop. The former can be best attained by leading a pure and chaste life, as was done by hundreds and thousands of monks and nuns, who had entered the sannyasin stage direct from the brahmacharya without passing through the married life. The widow should therefore never think of remarriage. This advice was, however, a one-sided one. Smritis do not offer it to the widower. On the other hand, they permit him to remarry immediately after the death of the first wife, quote, lest the sacred fires should remain unlit, stop, unquote. Para. A greater calamity that overtook the widow in this period was the revival of the sati custom. In the beginning, it was confined to the warrior class. It, however, began to spread wider in society in course of time as the action of the sati came to be regarded as a great religious sacrifice which deserved to be imitated. A school of rationalists opposed the custom vehemently, pointing out its utter futility and stupidity. Its efforts partly checked the spread of the custom for a while. Para. The only direction in which the position of women improved in this period was in the sphere of proprietary rights. Society had begun to discourage widow remarriages. As a consequence, there began to arise a class of childless young widows. In the earlier period, practically speaking, this class did not exist, as niyoga and widow remarriages were then in general vogue. Now, when both these practices were prohibited, society had to devise an honorable means to enable the widow to maintain herself. She could, of course, live in the joint family and receive maintenance along with others, but this was not an advisable step in the transition period during which niyoga was being gradually stamped out. Some writers have laid down that a woman should not be compelled to submit to niyoga against her wish. Footnote 8. It is clear that in uncultured families, some of the male relations, like the brothers-in-law, would occasionally force an unwilling widow to submit to their vicious wishes under the specious plea of niyoga. Stop. The childless widow could be saved from this calamity by sanctioning her a life estate in her husband's share and by permitting her to stay separately. Para. It thus came to happen that the proprietary rights which were not recognized in the Vedic age, when women were better educated and enjoyed greater freedom, came gradually to be recognized during this period. It is true that the doctrine of perpetual tutelage of page 62 women became popular at this time, and it should normally have proved fatal to the recognition and development of their proprietary rights. But men do not always seriously believe in the solemn theories they haughtily enunciate, nor do they care to draw all possible corollaries from them. Such was the case with the theory of women's perpetual tutelage. Jurists felt no self-contradiction in declaring that women were unfit for independence and yet investing them with new proprietary rights. They thought that sufficient regard would be shown to the theory of perpetual tutelage by laying down that women could enjoy only the income of their inheritance but not dispose of its corpus. Para. It is further true that the tendency to regard women as fragile and of a weak moral fiber was getting stronger in this period. It was, however, only the woman in the abstract that was so regarded. In society, however, the woman in the abstract did not exist. There was the wife or the daughter or the mother, and for every one of them, Hindu society felt very tenderly. The daughter and the wife had the father and the husband to provide for them, but there was no such guardian of natural affection to look after the childless widow. A school of jurists therefore arose at the beginning of the Christian era, which advocated that the widow should be recognized as an heir to her husband if the latter had effected his separation before the time of his death. The new reform was, as usual, vehemently opposed by vested interests, but eventually it began to find greater and greater support in society. Text continued in next file.